which created the agricultural surplus and the economic prosperity that enabled the Norse elite to invest in the kind of lavish cultural and ritual activity that the burial represents. The environmental conditions that favored the Viking Age expansion would not last forever, however, and the gradual cooling of the climate that began in the late medieval period, leading eventually to the Little Ice Age of the 14th through 19th centuries, had profound consequences for the Norse and for the rest of Europe. In Scandinavia, the cooling climate reduced agricultural productivity, shortened growing seasons, and made maritime travel more dangerous, contributing to a contraction of the Norse world that was the mirror image of the earlier expansion. The Greenland settlements, as we have seen, were among the casualties of this climatic shift, but the effects were felt throughout the Norse world. As communities that had prospered during the warm centuries struggled to adapt to the new, harsher conditions, and as the social and economic structures that had supported the Viking Age gradually gave way to the different structures of the later medieval period. The Black Death, which reached Scandinavia in 1349 and which killed an estimated 1/3 to 1/2 of the population, was another catastrophic blow, one that accelerated the social and economic transformations that were already underway, and that effectively ended the world that had produced the Oseberg ship and the other great artifacts of the Viking Age. The plague struck Scandinavia with devastating force, depopulating entire regions, collapsing trade networks, and disrupting the social hierarchies and cultural traditions that had sustained Norse civilization for centuries. The world that emerged from the plague was a different world, a world in which the old ways were increasingly a memory, in which the great burial mounds and the carved ships and the tapestries and the animal head posts were relics of a past that was receding rapidly into legend, and in which the Christian faith and the institutions of the medieval European Church had fully replaced the pagan traditions that had once governed every aspect of Norse life. It is against this backdrop of loss and transformation that the modern rediscovery of the Viking Age must be understood. The excavation of the Oseberg ship in 1904, like the earlier discoveries at Thun and Gokstad, was not merely an archaeological event but a cultural one, an act of recovery that brought the lost world of the Vikings back into the consciousness of the modern age, and that invested that world with new meanings and new significance. For the Norwegians of the early 20th century, the Oseberg ship was a source of national pride and cultural identity, a tangible link to a heroic past that validated their aspirations for independence and self-determination. For scholars, it was a treasure trove of information about a period and a civilization that had previously been known primarily through fragmentary literary sources and scattered archaeological finds. And for the wider public, it was a source of wonder and fascination, a reminder that the past held secrets and surprises that could still astonish and inspire, and that the earth beneath our feet might contain treasures beyond anything we could imagine. The resonance of the Oseberg discovery has only grown stronger with the passage of time, as new generations of scholars, artists, and ordinary people have discovered the ship and its contents and have found in them new meanings and new sources of inspiration. The Oseberg ship has been the subject of countless books, articles, exhibitions, and documentaries, and its image has become one of the most recognizable and most widely reproduced symbols of the Viking Age, appearing in contexts that range from serious academic publications to tourist brochures and children's picture books. The two Oseberg women, nameless and enigmatic as they remain, have become figures of enduring fascination, embodiments of the mystery and the allure of the Viking past, and their story, or rather the absence of their story, the silence that surrounds them, has become a canvas onto which modern audiences project their own questions, their own hopes, and their own anxieties about the past and its relationship to the present. The ongoing scientific investigation of the Oseberg finds continues to produce new insights and new surprises, demonstrating that the potential of these objects to yield information about the past is far from exhausted. Recent studies have employed a range of cutting-edge analytical techniques to examine the ship and its contents in ways that were not possible even a few decades ago, and the results have added new dimensions to our understanding of the burial and the world that produced it. Advanced imaging technologies, including CT scanning and 3D photogrammetry, have revealed details of the carved surfaces that are invisible to the naked eye, including tool marks that provide information about the techniques and the tools used by the craftsmen who produced the carvings, and traces of paint and pigment that suggest that many of the carved objects were originally brightly colored a finding that transforms our understanding of their visual impact and their aesthetic character. The carved surfaces that appear today as monochrome expanses of dark, age-stained wood were once alive with color, their intricate patterns and figures picked out in reds, yellows, blacks, and whites that would have made them vivid and striking to contemporary eyes, and the realization that we have been seeing these objects in a diminished and incomplete state for over a century is a humbling reminder of how much the passage of time can alter our perception of the past. Isotopic analysis of the materials used in the construction of the ship and the grave goods has provided new information about the sources of the raw materials and the trade networks through which they were obtained. The iron rivets that hold the ship's planks together, for example, have been analyzed to determine the geographic origin of the iron ore from which they were smelted, and the results suggest that the iron may have come from local Norwegian sources consistent with the well-documented tradition of iron production in Viking Age Scandinavia, where bog iron was smelted in small-scale bloomery furnaces that were a common feature of the rural landscape. The analysis of the wood used in the construction of the various objects has identified a range of species, including oak, beech, birch, pine, and yew, each chosen for its particular properties and each reflecting the deep knowledge of wood and its characteristics that was one of the hallmarks of Norse material culture. The study of the animal remains from the Oseberg burial has also yielded new information, including the identification of the breeds and the health conditions of the horses and dogs that were sacrificed as part of the funeral ceremony. The horses appear to have been of a type consistent with the Norse breeds that are still found in Scandinavia today, relatively small but sturdy and well adapted to the harsh northern environment, and some of them show signs of having been well cared for and well fed, suggesting that they were valued animals, perhaps the personal mounts or breeding stock of the deceased. The dogs too appear to have been of specific types, including what may have been hunting dogs and companion animals, and their inclusion in the burial reflects the important role that dogs played in Norse society, both as practical working animals and as beloved companions whose loyalty and devotion were valued and celebrated. The microarchaeological study of the soil and sediment samples collected during the original excavation and during subsequent investigations of the mound has provided additional information about the conditions within the burial, the processes of decomposition and preservation that operated over the centuries, and the natural and human-caused disturbances that affected the mound after the burial was sealed. These studies have confirmed that the blue clay played a crucial role in the preservation of the organic materials, creating an anaerobic environment that inhibited the growth of the bacteria and fungi that normally cause the decay of wood, leather, and textile, and that the remarkable state of preservation in which the objects were found was due largely to this fortuitous geological circumstance. The studies have also provided evidence for the medieval break-in that disturbed the burial chamber, including traces of the tunnel that the robbers dug to reach the interior of the mound and the disturbed and redeposited soil that marks the path of their intrusion. The continuing investigation of the Oseberg finds is a reminder that archaeological objects are not static entities whose meaning and significance are fixed at the moment of discovery, but dynamic sources of information that can yield new insights as new questions are asked and new methods are developed. The objects that Gustafson pulled from the earth in 1904 are the same objects that sit in the museum today, but our understanding of them has changed enormously over the intervening century, and it will continue to change as future generations of scholars bring new perspectives, new technologies, and new questions to bear on this extraordinary assemblage of material culture. The Oseberg ship is not a puzzle that can be solved and then set aside. It is an ongoing conversation between the present and the past, a dialogue that enriches both parties and that has no foreseeable end. The human dimension of this story, the dimension of individual experience, of personal emotion, of the irreducible particularity of each human life, is perhaps the most important and the most elusive aspect of the Oseberg discovery. The objects in the burial are magnificent, and they tell us a great deal about the technology, the economy, the art, and the religion of 9th century Scandinavia, but they tell us relatively little about the specific individuals who were laid to rest in the ship, about their names, their personalities, their relationships, their joys, and their sorrows. The older woman, whoever she was, lived a long life that was marked by physical suffering in its final years, and the younger woman, whoever she was, died in the prime of her life, and beyond these bare facts, we know almost nothing about them as individuals. We do not know what they looked like, what they thought, what they feared, what they loved. We do not know whether they went to their deaths willingly or unwillingly, peacefully or in pain. We do not know whether they were mourned with genuine grief or with the calculated display of political theatre. We do not know whether they believed in the gods to whom the elaborate rituals of their funeral were directed, or whether they harbored private doubts about the faith that governed their world. What we do know is that they were human, that they lived and loved and suffered and died as all humans do, and that the people who buried them cared enough to send them into the darkness with the finest things that their world could produce, with a ship of surpassing beauty, with carved and woven masterworks of art, with food and tools and animals and all the provisions that they might need for the journey that lay ahead. This caring, this devotion, this refusal to let the dead go empty-handed into the unknown is something that transcends the specific cultural context of the Viking Age and speaks to a universal human impulse, the impulse to honor the dead, to ease their passage, to maintain the bonds of love and obligation that connect the living and the dead in a web of mutual responsibility and mutual care. The Oseberg ship, in its museum gallery, is a vessel that has completed 2 voyages. The first was the voyage that it made across the waters of the Oslo fjord in the 9th century, carrying its living passengers through the bright, cold air of the Norwegian coast, its sail filled with wind, its oars dipping into the dark water, its carved prow cutting through the waves with the effortless grace of a thing that was born to the sea. The second was the voyage that it made through time, through 1,000 years of darkness and silence and slow, patient preservation in the blue clay of Vestfold, a voyage that ended not in the afterlife of Norse mythology, but in the glass and steel of a modern museum, where it rests now in the light of the 21st century, surrounded by the curious and the reverent, the scholars and the tourists, the children who press their faces to the barriers, and the elders who stand quietly in the shadows, all of them drawn by the same irresistible pull, the pull of beauty, of mystery, of the past reaching out to the present across the unbridgeable gulf of time. Both voyages were journeys into the unknown, both required courage, skill, and faith, and both, in their different ways, have brought the Oseberg ship and its passengers to a destination that their makers could never have imagined. A destination that is not a place but a state of being, a state of perpetual discovery, of perpetual questioning, of perpetual wonder at the capacity of human beings to create beauty in the face of darkness and to send their best and most beloved into the night with a tenderness that neither time nor death nor the weight of 1,000 years of earth can ever fully extinguish. The Oseberg ship sails on, not across the water but across the centuries, carrying its cargo of mystery and meaning, its silent passengers, its unanswered questions, and its enduring, inexhaustible beauty into a future that will continue to receive it with the awe and the gratitude that it so richly deserves. For as long as there are human beings who care about the past, who honor the dead, and who believe that the stories buried in the earth are stories worth the telling. And so the mound on the farm called Oseberg, which held its secret for more than a millennium, which endured the centuries of forgetting and the slow erosion of wind and rain and the quiet encroachment of roots and grasses, which survived the conversion and the plague and the wars and the revolutions and the relentless transforming pressure of modernity upon the ancient landscape of Vestfold, has given up its treasure at last, and the treasure has proved to be greater than anyone could have imagined, not because of the gold and silver that the medieval robbers carried away and that is lost forever, but because of the wood and the cloth and the iron and the bone that they left behind, the humble materials from which a civilization built its monument and expressed its deepest truths, the materials that have survived because they were deemed worthless by those who sought only wealth, and that have turned out to be worth more than all the gold in Scandinavia, because they carry within them the memory of a world, the echo of a people, the trace of hands that shaped and wove and carved and hammered with a skill and a devotion that speak to us still, across the long silence of the centuries, with a voice that is quiet but clear, patient but insistent, and that says, simply and profoundly, we were here, we lived, we made beautiful things, and we sent our dead into the darkness with love. The earth remembers what the living forget, and in the case of the Oseberg ship, the earth remembered with a fidelity and a generosity that has few parallels in the entire history of archaeological discovery. But the story of Viking ship burials did not end with Oseberg, nor did it begin there, and to fully appreciate the significance of what emerged from that mound in Vestfold County in the summer of 1904, one must consider the broader tradition of ship burial across the Norse world and the other remarkable discoveries that have expanded and enriched our understanding of this extraordinary funerary practice in the decades and centuries since. The first timbers were pulled from the clay. The tradition of placing the dead in boats and ships extends far back into the prehistoric past of Scandinavia, long before the Viking Age, into the Bronze Age and the early Iron Age, when the peoples of the north already associated the ship with the journey to the afterlife, and when images of boats and ships were carved into the rocks of coastal Scandinavia in a tradition of petroglyphic art that is among the most extensive and most enigmatic in Europe. The rock carvings of Bohuslän in Sweden, of Alta in northern Norway, and of numerous other sites across Scandinavia depict ships of varying sizes and configurations, sometimes carrying human figures, sometimes accompanied by images of animals, weapons, and celestial bodies, and sometimes appearing in contexts that suggest ritual or ceremonial activity. These images, which date from roughly 1800 BCE to 500 BCE, are the earliest evidence of the symbolic association between ships and the sacred in Scandinavian culture, and they demonstrate that the ship burial tradition of the Viking Age was not a sudden innovation, but the culmination of a symbolic and ritual tradition that had been developing for millennia. The pre-Viking ship burials of the Vendel period, the centuries immediately preceding the Viking Age, provide a particularly important precedent for the great ship burials of the 9th and 10th centuries. At the sites of Vendel and Valsgärde in the upland region of Sweden, a series of richly furnished boat burials dating from the 6th to the 11th centuries have been excavated, revealing a continuous tradition of elite burial in boats that spans the transition from the pre-Viking to the Viking period, and that provides invaluable context for understanding the development and the significance of the ship burial practice. The Vendel and Valsgärde burials are smaller in scale than the great ship burials of Vestfold. The vessels are boats rather than full-sized ships, but they are richly furnished with weapons, helmets, shields, domestic equipment, and animal remains, and they demonstrate that the association between elite status, maritime symbolism, and elaborate funerary ritual was well established in Scandinavia long before the Viking Age began. The helmets found in the Vendel and Valsgärde burials are among the most spectacular objects to survive from pre-Viking Scandinavia, and they provide an important point of comparison with the material culture of the Viking Age. These helmets are elaborately decorated with pressed metal plates depicting scenes of warriors, riders, and mythological figures, and their style and iconography show strong connections to the artistic traditions of the Anglo-Saxon world, particularly to the famous helmet from the Sutton Hoo ship burial in Suffolk, England, which is one of the most iconic objects in British archaeology. The Sutton Hoo burial, discovered in 1939 on the eve of the Second World War, is itself a ship burial, a burial of an Anglo-Saxon king, probably Raedwald of East Anglia, in a full-sized clinker-built ship beneath a monumental mound, accompanied by a dazzling array of grave goods that include gold jewelry, silver plate, weapons, and objects of Byzantine and Merovingian origin. The parallels between the Sutton Hoo burial and the Norse ship burials of Scandinavia are striking and significant, reflecting the shared Germanic cultural heritage of the Anglo-Saxons and the Norse and the common symbolic vocabulary that linked ships, death, and elite power across the early medieval North. The Sutton Hoo discovery, like the Oseberg discovery before it, had a transformative impact on the scholarly and public understanding of the early medieval period, revealing a level of artistic achievement, material wealth, and cultural sophistication that challenged prevailing assumptions about the supposed barbarism and primitiveness of the Germanic peoples of the post-Roman world. The gold and garnet jewelry found at Sutton Hoo, the great silver dish from Byzantium, the elaborately decorated helmet with its face mask and its scenes of heroic combat, all of these objects spoke of a world of power, beauty, and far-reaching cultural connections that was far more complex and far more impressive than the popular imagination had allowed, and they demonstrated, as the Oseberg ship had demonstrated for the Norse, that the material culture of the early medieval Germanic world was worthy of the most serious scholarly attention and the most profound public admiration. The connection between the Sutton Hoo and the Scandinavian ship burial traditions raises important questions about the nature and the extent of cultural exchange between the Anglo-Saxon and the Norse worlds in the centuries before the Viking Age, a period when the peoples of the North Sea region were linked by ties of trade, migration, and shared cultural heritage that made the boundaries between different ethnic and linguistic groups more fluid and more permeable than they would later become. The ship burial practice itself may have traveled between Scandinavia and England along these networks of exchange, carried by migrants, traders, or returning warriors who brought with them the customs and the beliefs of their homelands and who adapted them to the new cultural contexts in which they found themselves. The precise direction of influence, whether the ship burial tradition moved from Scandinavia to England or from England to Scandinavia, or developed independently in both regions from a common Germanic heritage, is a question that scholars continue to debate, and the evidence is sufficiently ambiguous to support multiple interpretations. Beyond the shores of the North Sea, the tradition of ship burial and ship symbolism in funerary contexts can be traced across a wide swath of the medieval world, from the boat burials of the Baltic and the Finnish coast, to the ship-shaped stone settings of Gotland and the ship cremations described by Ibn Fadlan on the Volga. Each of these manifestations of the ship burial tradition has its own distinctive character and its own local significance, but they all share the fundamental association between the ship and the journey to the afterlife that is the defining feature of the tradition as a whole, and they all testify to the central role that maritime culture and maritime symbolism played in the religious and social life of the peoples of Northern Europe during the early medieval period. The Oseberg ship, in this broader context, is not an isolated phenomenon, but the supreme expression of a tradition that was shared, in varying forms and to varying degrees, by peoples across the northern world, a tradition that reflected the deep and abiding relationship between the peoples of the north and the sea that surrounded them, sustained them, and carried them to the ends of the earth. The question of what happened to the tradition of ship burial after the conversion to Christianity is one that has interested scholars for many years, and the answer is more complex and more nuanced than a simple narrative of replacement and disappearance would suggest. While the formal practice of burying the dead in ships or boats did indeed decline and eventually cease as Christianity spread through Scandinavia, the symbolic association between ships and death persisted in various forms throughout the medieval period and beyond, finding expression in the ship-shaped churchyards that have been identified at several sites in Scandinavia, in the ship imagery that appears on medieval Scandinavian tombstones and memorial stones, and in the folk traditions and superstitions that associated ships with the passage of the dead and the journey to the otherworld well into the modern era. The ship, it seems, was too deeply embedded in the cultural imagination of the Scandinavian peoples to be easily or completely eradicated by the new faith, and its symbolic power persisted long after the rituals that had given it its most dramatic expression had been abandoned. In the Faroe Islands and in Iceland, where the Norse settlers established communities that were among the most remote and most culturally conservative in the Norse world, traces of the old funerary traditions can be detected in the archaeological record well into the Christian period, suggesting that the conversion process was particularly slow and uneven in these isolated communities, and that the old ways coexisted with the new for generations or even centuries after the formal adoption of Christianity. Boat burials of the Viking Age have been found in both the Faroes and Iceland, and while they are generally smaller and less elaborately furnished than the great ship burials of mainland Scandinavia, they testify to the wide geographic spread of the tradition and to its importance as a marker of Norse cultural identity in the diaspora communities of the North Atlantic. The legacy of the Oseberg ship extends into realms that are not strictly scholarly or archaeological, touching upon questions of national identity, cultural heritage, and the politics of the past that are as relevant today as they were a century ago. In Norway, the Oseberg ship and the other Viking ships have long been central to the national narrative, symbols of a distinctive Norwegian identity that is rooted in the maritime traditions and the seafaring achievements of the Norse, and their preservation and display have been matters of national concern and national pride. The planned construction of the new Museum of the Viking Age on Yggdrasil, which will replace the aging Viking ship museum and provide a state-of-the-art facility for the display and conservation of the ships and their associated finds, is the latest chapter in this ongoing story of national engagement with the Viking past, a story that reflects the continuing importance of the ships as touchstones of Norwegian identity and as objects of global cultural significance. The international dimension of the Oseberg ship's legacy is equally important, as the ship and its contents have become objects of fascination and admiration for audiences around the world, transcending national boundaries and cultural differences to speak to a universal human interest in the past and its material remains. The Oseberg ship has been featured in exhibitions and publications across Europe and beyond, and its image has become one of the most widely recognized symbols of the Viking Age, appearing in contexts that range from academic conferences to popular media to the logos and branding of commercial enterprises. The global reach of the Oseberg ship's fame is a testament to the universal appeal of its beauty and its mystery, and to the power of material objects to transcend the specific cultural contexts in which they were created and to speak to audiences who are separated from their makers by vast distances of time, space, and cultural experience. The ethical dimensions of the Oseberg discovery and its aftermath also deserve consideration, as they raise questions about the rights and responsibilities of those who discover, study, and display the remains of the dead, questions that have become increasingly prominent in archaeological and museum practice in recent years. The two women buried in the Oseberg ship were not abstract historical figures but real human beings, individuals who lived, suffered, and died, and whose remains were disturbed, examined, and put on public display by people who had no personal connection to them and who could not have obtained their consent for these actions. The ethical issues involved in the excavation and display of human remains are complex and contested, and they have been the subject of intense debate within the archaeological and museum communities, with some arguing that the scientific and educational value of studying and displaying human remains justifies the disturbance of the dead, and others arguing that the dead have a right to rest undisturbed and that the display of their remains is inherently disrespectful regardless of the scientific benefits that may result. In the case of the Oseberg women, these ethical concerns are compounded by the fact that we do not know who they were, what they believed, or how they would have felt about having their remains removed from the burial that had been so carefully prepared for them and placed in a museum for the inspection of strangers. The elaborate nature of the Oseberg burial suggests that the people who arranged it intended the mound to be a permanent resting place, a sacred space in which the dead would remain undisturbed for eternity, and the disturbance of that space, first by the medieval robbers and then by the 20th century archaeologists, represents a violation of that intention, however well-intentioned and however scientifically justified the modern excavation may have been. The question of whether the Oseberg women should be reburied, as some indigenous communities around the world have demanded for the remains of their ancestors, has not been seriously raised in the Norwegian context, but it is a question that lurks at the edges of the conversation about the ethics of archaeological practice, and that may become more prominent as societal attitudes toward the treatment of human remains continue to evolve. The Oseberg ship and its contents have also played a role in contemporary debates about cultural heritage, cultural property, and the ownership of the past, debates that have been fueled by high-profile disputes over the return of archaeological and artistic objects to their countries or communities of origin. Norway's possession of the Oseberg finds has not been challenged in the way that, for example, Greece has challenged the British Museum's possession of the Elgin marbles, but the broader questions raised by these disputes, questions about who owns the past, who has the right to display and interpret it, and who benefits from its commodification, are relevant to the Oseberg story and to the story of Viking Age archaeology more generally. The Norse world was a world of movement and exchange, a world in which people, objects, and ideas traveled across vast distances, and in which the boundaries between cultures were fluid and permeable, and the question of who can claim ownership of the material heritage of that world is one that resists simple answers and that demands careful, nuanced, and respectful engagement with the complex realities of history and identity. As the light falls through the windows of the museum gallery and illuminates the dark, ancient timbers of the Oseberg ship, it illuminates also the faces of the people who have come to see it, people from every corner of the world, people of every age and background, drawn by curiosity, by admiration, by a desire to connect with something larger than themselves, something older and deeper and more enduring than the transient concerns of daily life. They stand before the ship in silence, or they whisper to each other in a dozen different languages, and they look at the carved serpents and the soaring prow and the elegant curve of the hull, and they feel, however dimly, however imperfectly, the presence of the world that created this extraordinary object, the world of the Oseberg women, the world of the Norse, a world that is gone but that has left behind, in the blue clay of a Norwegian hillside, a message that time has not erased and that silence has not silenced. The message is simple, and it is profound. It is a message about the human capacity for beauty, for devotion, for the transformation of raw materials, into objects of transcendent meaning. It is a message about the power of the dead to speak to the living across the vast gulf of time, through the objects that they held and the rituals that they performed and the ships that they built and sailed and buried. It is a message about the fragility and the resilience of the material record, about the improbable survival of wood and cloth and iron through 1,000 years of darkness and compression, about the fortuitous chemistry of blue clay and the patient, painstaking work of the archaeologists and conservators who have dedicated their careers to the preservation of these irreplaceable objects. And it is a message about the enduring human need to remember, to honor, to understand, and to tell the stories of those who came before us. Stories that are not merely entertaining or edifying but essential to our understanding of ourselves and of our place in the world, and of the long, continuous thread of human experience that connects the present to the past and the past to the future. The Oseberg ship has made its final voyage from the darkness of the mound to the light of the museum, from the silence of 1,000 years to the murmur of 1,000,000 visitors, from the world of the dead to the world of the living. It will not sail again, not on the waters of the fjord, not on the seas of the afterlife, but it sails still in the imagination of everyone who sees it, everyone who reads about it, everyone who stands before it and feels the pull of the past and the wonder of discovery. It sails on the currents of scholarship and education, carrying its cargo of knowledge and insight to new generations of students and scholars who will continue to study it, to learn from it, and to be inspired by it. It sails on the winds of cultural memory, a symbol of a civilization that was both fierce and tender, both brutal and beautiful, both alien and recognizably, achingly human. And it sails, above all, on the inexhaustible tide of human curiosity, that restless, relentless, magnificent impulse that drives us to dig into the earth, to peer into the darkness, to ask what lies beneath, and to be changed forever by what we find. They found a Viking ship buried underground, and what was inside changed everything. It changed our understanding of the Viking Age, revealing a civilization of extraordinary artistic achievement, spiritual complexity, and social sophistication that the popular stereotype of the marauding barbarian had entirely obscured. It changed our understanding of women in the Norse world, demonstrating that women could occupy positions of the highest status and could be honored in death with a lavishness that rivaled anything bestowed upon kings and warriors. It changed our understanding of Norse art, establishing the Oseberg style as the first in a sequence of distinctive decorative traditions that together constitute one of the great artistic achievements of the medieval world. It changed our understanding of Norse shipbuilding, providing a complete and magnificently preserved example of the technology that carried the Norse across the seas and that made the Viking Age possible. It changed our understanding of Norse religion, offering a window into the complex and richly symbolic world of pre-Christian belief and practice that the written sources alone could never have opened. And it changed our understanding of ourselves, of our relationship with the past, of our capacity for wonder and discovery, and of the power of material objects to transcend the boundaries of time and speak to us with a clarity and an eloquence that no written text can match. The earth gave up its secret, and the secret was a ship, and the ship was a world, and the world was a mirror, and in the mirror we see not only the faces of the two women who were laid to rest in the blue clay of Vestfold over 1100 years ago, but also our own faces, looking back at us across the centuries with an expression that is at once familiar and strange, an expression that asks us to remember, to understand, to care, and to carry the story forward into the light, into the future, into the endless, beautiful, unfinished voyage of human knowledge and human memory. A voyage that began when someone first looked at the earth and wondered what lay beneath, and that will continue for as long as there are hands to dig and eyes to see and hearts to be moved by what the earth, in its patience and its generosity, has chosen to preserve. There is a quietness that settles over the landscape of Vestfold in the late autumn, when the last of the harvest has been gathered and the fields lie bare under skies that grow heavier and lower with each passing day, when the waters of the Oslo fjord turn from the bright, cold blue of summer to the deep, slate grey of the approaching winter, and when the ancient burial mounds that dot the countryside seem to sink a little deeper into the earth, as though drawing closer to the dead who sleep within them. It is in this season, when the boundary between the living and the dead feels thinnest, when the long Nordic darkness begins its slow encroachment and the world seems to hold its breath before the coming of the cold, that one can most easily imagine what it must have been like to stand on this ground 1,000 years ago and to watch as a ship was drawn up from the shore, its keels scraping against the earth, its prow catching the last light of the autumn sun, and to know that this ship would never touch the water again, that its final voyage would be downward into the darkness of the mound, carrying its passengers into the silence of the earth and the mystery of whatever lay beyond. The funeral of the Oseberg women, whenever and however it took place, was an event of immense significance for the community that witnessed it, a moment of collective grief, collective ritual, and collective affirmation that brought together the social, religious, and political dimensions of Norse life in a single, concentrated act of extraordinary power. The preparation for such a funeral would have begun long before the day of the burial itself, perhaps weeks or even months in advance. As the ship was selected and prepared, the grave goods were assembled, the animals were chosen for sacrifice, and the ritual specialists, whether priests, priestesses, or Völvas, were consulted about the proper forms and procedures to be followed. The logistics alone would have been formidable. The ship had to be transported from the water to the burial site, a distance that may have been considerable, and that would have required the labor of many hands and the use of rollers, sledges, or other mechanical aids to move the heavy vessel overland. The trench or platform on which the ship was to rest had to be prepared, the burial chamber had to be constructed on the deck, and the grave goods had to be arranged within and around the vessel in a manner that was both practically effective and ritually correct, satisfying the requirements of tradition and the expectations of the community. The sacrifice of the animals was itself a ritual act of considerable significance, one that required both practical skill and spiritual authority. The killing of 15 horses, 6 dogs, and 2 cows was not a casual or thoughtless act, but a deliberate and meaningful offering, a gift to the dead and to the gods that was intended to ensure the well-being of the deceased in the afterlife and to demonstrate the wealth and piety of the family and community that arranged the funeral. In Norse religious practice, animal sacrifice or blot was one of the central ritual activities, a means of communicating with the gods and of maintaining the reciprocal relationship between the human and the divine that was the foundation of Norse religious life. The blood of the sacrificed animals was believed to carry a sacred power, a life force that could be transferred to the dead, to the gods, or to the community through the act of sacrifice, and the ritual shedding of blood was accompanied by prayers, invocations, and other ceremonial actions that invested the act with layers of meaning that went far beyond the merely practical. The possibility that one of the 2 women found in the Oseberg burial was herself a sacrifice, a human offering sent to accompany the primary occupant of the grave into the afterlife, is one of the most disturbing and most debated aspects of the discovery. Human sacrifice is attested in the Norse world through both literary and archaeological evidence, though the extent and the frequency of the practice remain matters of scholarly disagreement. The account of Ibn Fadlan, which describes the ritual killing of a slave girl during a chieftain's funeral on the Volga, is the most detailed and the most vivid literary description of human sacrifice in a Norse funerary context, and it has been widely cited as evidence that the practice was known and accepted in at least some parts of the Viking world. Archaeological evidence for human sacrifice is more ambiguous because it is often difficult to distinguish between a sacrificial victim and a companion or attendant who died of natural causes or who was killed in some other context, but there are cases in which the physical evidence, such as signs of violent death, unusual body positioning, or the presence of restraints, strongly suggest that the individual was killed as part of a ritual act. In the case of the Oseberg burial, the skeletal evidence does not provide a clear answer to the question of whether either woman was a sacrifice. The bones were disturbed by the medieval break-in, and the displacement of the remains makes it difficult to determine the original arrangement of the bodies or to identify signs of violence or restraint that might indicate a sacrificial death. Some scholars have pointed to the difference in age between the 2 women as suggestive of a mistress and servant relationship, with the younger woman serving as a companion or attendant who was sent to accompany the older woman into the afterlife, but this interpretation is far from universally accepted, and other scholars have proposed alternative explanations, including the possibility that the 2 women were related by blood, that they died at the same time from a common cause such as disease, or that the burial represents a double interment of 2 individuals of equal or comparable status who happen to die within a short period of each other. The ambiguity surrounding the relationship between the two Oseberg women is a reminder of the limits of archaeological interpretation, of the gap that inevitably exists between the physical evidence and the human realities that it represents, and of the need for humility and caution in drawing conclusions about the beliefs and the practices of people who left no written record of their thoughts and intentions. The objects in the Oseberg burial are eloquent, but they are not transparent. They speak, but they speak in a language that we can only partially understand, a language of symbol and metaphor, of ritual and tradition, of cultural assumptions and shared beliefs that were so deeply embedded in the fabric of Norse life that they were never explicitly articulated or explained, because everyone who lived within that culture knew what they meant, just as everyone who lives within our own culture knows the meanings of the symbols and the rituals that surround us without ever needing to have them spelled out. The challenge of interpreting the Oseberg burial is, in this sense, the challenge of all archaeology, the challenge of reading a text that was never intended to be read by outsiders, a text that was written not in words but in objects, not in sentences but in arrangements, not in arguments but in actions, and that requires of its readers a combination of knowledge, imagination, empathy, and intellectual honesty that is among the most demanding and most rewarding of all scholarly endeavors. The scholars who have devoted their careers to the study of the Oseberg finds have brought all of these qualities to their work, and their collective achievement, built up over more than a century of patient, meticulous, and often inspired investigation, represents one of the great triumphs of archaeological scholarship, a body of knowledge that has transformed our understanding of the Viking Age and that continues to grow and evolve with each new discovery, each new analysis, and each new perspective that is brought to bear on this inexhaustible source of information and inspiration. The broader significance of the Oseberg discovery for the discipline of archaeology itself deserves recognition, because the excavation and conservation of the Oseberg finds raised methodological and technical challenges that pushed the boundaries of what was possible in archaeological practice and that contributed to the development of new techniques and new standards that have benefited the discipline as a two-whole. The challenges of excavating waterlogged wooden objects, of conserving organic materials that begin to deteriorate as soon as they are exposed to air, of documenting complex three-dimensional assemblages of artifacts, and of reconstructing fragmented and distorted objects from hundreds of individual pieces, all of these challenges were confronted and at least partially overcome during the Oseberg project, and the solutions that were developed, however imperfect they may have been by modern standards, represented significant advances in the state of the art and served as models and cautionary tales for subsequent generations of archaeologists working with similar materials. The conservation challenges posed by the Oseberg finds have been particularly influential because they have highlighted the long-term consequences of conservation decisions and have underscored the importance of thinking not just about the immediate stabilization of objects, but about their preservation over decades and centuries, timescales that extend far beyond the professional lifetimes of individual conservators and that require a degree of foresight and humility that is not always easy to achieve. The problems caused by the alum treatment of the Oseberg wood, problems that only became apparent decades after the treatment was applied, have served as a sobering reminder that the best-intentioned interventions can have unforeseen consequences, and that the principle of reversibility, the idea that conservation treatments should be capable of being undone if they prove to be harmful, is not merely a theoretical nicety but a practical necessity. The lessons learned from the Oseberg conservation experience have informed the development of conservation protocols and best practices across the field, and they have contributed to a more cautious, more reflective, and more scientifically rigorous approach to the preservation of archaeological materials that has benefited collections and institutions around the world. The story of the Oseberg ship is also a story about the relationship between science and the humanities, between the analytical techniques of the natural sciences and the interpretive methods of history, art history, and cultural studies, and about the ways in which these different approaches to knowledge can complement and enrich each other when they are brought together in the study of a common object. The Oseberg finds have been studied by chemists and physicists, by biologists and geologists, by metallurgists and textile scientists, by art historians and literary scholars, by anthropologists and religious study specialists, and by many others whose expertise has contributed to the extraordinarily rich and multidimensional understanding of the burial that exists today. This interdisciplinary approach, which has become increasingly common in archaeological research over the past several decades, reflects a recognition that the objects of the past are too complex and too multifaceted to be fully understood from any single disciplinary perspective, and that the most productive and the most illuminating insights often emerge from the intersection of different fields, from the conversation between scientists and humanists, between analysts and interpreters, between those who study the material properties of objects and those who study their cultural meanings. The Oseberg ship, as an object that is simultaneously a feat of engineering, a work of art, a religious statement, a political monument, and a personal memorial, is an ideal subject for this kind of interdisciplinary investigation, and the history of its study is a history of fruitful collaboration between researchers from many different backgrounds and traditions. The ship's timbers have been analyzed by wood scientists who can identify the species, the age, and the geographic origin of the trees from which they were cut. Its iron rivets have been studied by metallurgists who can determine the composition and the quality of the iron and the techniques used to forge it. Its carvings have been examined by art historians who can identify the stylistic traditions to which they belong and the individual hands that produce them. Its textiles have been analyzed by textile scientists who can determine the fiber types, the dye sources, the weaving techniques, and the wear patterns that they exhibit. And its human and animal remains have been studied by physical anthropologists, geneticists, and veterinary scientists who can determine the age, sex, health, diet, and geographic origins of the individuals and animals buried within the mound. Each of these analyses contributes a piece to the puzzle, and together they create a picture of the Oseberg burial that is far richer and far more detailed than any single discipline could achieve on its own. The future of Oseberg scholarship is likely to be shaped by the continued development and application of new scientific techniques, many of which are still in their infancy and whose potential for revealing new information about the burial has yet to be fully realized. Ancient DNA analysis, which has already produced surprising results regarding the genetic origins of the younger Oseberg woman, is a rapidly advancing field that may eventually provide much more detailed information about the ancestry, the family relationships, and the health of the individuals buried in the mound. Proteomics, the study of ancient proteins preserved in archaeological materials, is another emerging field with enormous potential, capable of identifying animal species from tiny fragments of bone, skin, or hair, and of detecting traces of food, drink, or other organic substances that have been absorbed into the surfaces of containers and utensils. Advances in imaging technology, including the development of ever more powerful and more sensitive scanning and photographic techniques, will continue to reveal details of the carved and woven surfaces that are invisible to the naked eye, and that may provide new clues about the techniques, the tools, and the intentions of the craftspeople who created them. These future discoveries, whatever form they take, will add new chapters to a story that has been unfolding for more than a century, and that shows no signs of reaching its conclusion. The Oseberg ship and its contents are, in a very real sense, inexhaustible, a source of information and inspiration that will continue to reward investigation for as long as there are scholars willing to undertake it, and as long as the objects themselves survive the ravages of time and chemistry. The challenge of ensuring that survival, of preserving the Oseberg finds for future generations and for the future scholars who will bring to them questions and techniques that we cannot yet imagine, is perhaps the most important and the most daunting task that faces the custodians of this extraordinary collection, and it is a task that deserves the full support and engagement of the Norwegian state, the international scholarly community, and the global public that has come to regard the Oseberg ship as one of the treasures of human civilization. As we reach the end of this long meditation on the Oseberg ship and the world that created it, it is worth pausing to reflect on what this single archaeological discovery has meant for our understanding of the human past and for our sense of connection to the people who lived in that past. The Oseberg ship is many things: a masterpiece of naval architecture, a treasury of decorative art, a document of religious belief and funerary practice, a monument of female power and prestige, a testament to the skill and the creativity of the Norse craftsmen, and a window into a world that was both profoundly different from our own and profoundly connected to it by the shared threads of human experience, of love and loss, of beauty and mortality, of the desire to make meaning in the face of the unknown and to send the dead into the darkness with dignity and with hope. But above all, the Oseberg ship is a reminder that the past is not dead, that it lives on in the objects that survive it, and that the effort to recover, to preserve, to study, and to understand those objects is one of the noblest and most important undertakings that human beings can pursue, because it is through this effort that we maintain our connection to the long chain of human experience that stretches back beyond the reach of memory and that extends forward into a future that we cannot see but that we are helping, through our stewardship of the past, to shape. The two women who were laid to rest in the Oseberg ship over 1100 years ago did not know that their burial would one day be discovered, that their ship would be pulled from the earth and placed in a museum, that their story would be told and retold by people speaking languages they had never heard in lands they had never imagined. They did not know that the objects they took with them into the darkness would survive the centuries and would speak with quiet eloquence to audiences separated from them by a gulf of time and culture and experience that would seem, by any rational measure, unbridgeable. They did not know, and they could not have known, that the blue clay of Vestfold would prove to be a more faithful guardian of their memory than any saga, any poem, any runestone, any monument of wood or stone that human hands could build. But the clay kept faith with them, and the earth held them safe, and when the time came, when the world was ready to hear what they had to say, the earth gave back the ship and the sledges and the cart and the tapestries and the animal head posts and the tools and the seeds and the bones, gave back everything except their names and their voices and the living warmth of their presence, and in doing so made possible the extraordinary act of recovery and understanding that we call archaeology, the act of listening to the silence of the past and hearing, within that silence, the faint but unmistakable echo of lives that were lived with passion, with purpose, with beauty, and with an unshakable faith that the journey does not end with death, that the ship sails on, that the voyage continues, beyond the mound, beyond the darkness, beyond the silence, into whatever lies on the other side of the horizon, waiting to be discovered,